some of the findings from that, but most of that remains to be analysed and written up still. In the third part, I'm going to address some of the themes of this particular project, so access to secondary education in the country more directly. And it wasn't the focus of our research, so I've drawn on some of the interviews that I conducted while I was in the Marshall Islands, but I've also drawn on some kind of statistical data. And I have to underline here that drawing on statistical data is not, I repeat, not a strength of mine, so you'll have to bear with me on that. Okay, so let's just move to the kind of context of the Marshall Islands. So most people I speak to don't have any idea where the Marshall Islands are. Indeed, they're so tiny that they're barely visible on world maps, if at all. That is changing largely due to the work of an activist Marshallese poet called Kathy Jetnall-Kitchener, who has raised the profile of this island nation in many ways. In fact, it was her poetry that inspired our research project in the first place. In her poem, Lessons from Hawaii, in which she explores the racism experienced by Marshallese and other Micronesian migrants to the US state of Hawaii, she describes their islands in this way. Micronesian, Micronesian, as in small, tiny crumbs of islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean. Too many countries, cultures, nations no one has heard about, cares about, too small to notice. Echoing the time when the United States was deciding where to test their atomic weapons in the post-war period, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger was infamously cited as saying, "There's only 9,000 people out there, who gives a damn?" The Republic of the Marshall Islands are comprised of 29 coral atolls and 5 limestone islands in the North Pacific Ocean. They're composed of 1,225 individual islands and islets spread out over 750,000 square miles of ocean, but only 70 square miles of landmass. Traditionally, they were named Elon Kainad, these islands of ours. The eastern chain of islands was and still is called Ratak, which means sunrise. The western chain is the Ralik, or sunset chain. So there is more sea than land in the Marshall Islands. And as one of my informants, Elson Kalin, put it, we are ocean people, we're water people. The Marshallese were master navigators who learned to journey through vast seas using their knowledge not just of stars, but of the ocean currents and swells, the movements of which they learned by lying down at the bottom of their canoes and feeling the movement of the water beneath them. The image on the left of this slide here is a Marshallese stick chart, which was used as an educational tool for teaching how to navigate the oceans around the different atolls. It's made of shells and parts of the pandanus plant found along the beaches of RMI. The shells represent the atolls, the sticks are arranged to show the ocean currents, which you can steer your canoe. And next to it is a model of a traditional Marshallese wallup or voyaging canoe. And I'll come back a bit later to canoes if I have time. So this is very briefly the history of the Marshall Islands. So it does have a long history of occupation and colonization. And I'll just focus on the history from World War II onwards. So in 1947, following the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, it came under the control of the United States as a United Nations mandated trust territory of the Pacific Islands. In 1979, the Marshall Islands became self-governing, and in 1986 entered into a Compact of Free Association, or COFA, with the US, which gave its citizens the right to live and work in the United States without a visa or resident card. The current COFA, which I think is the third extension of it, the third iteration of it, is due to end in 2023. And it has resulted in over 1/3 of the population of the Marshall Islands, that's approximately 22,000 people, relocating to the US in the last 3 decades. The most popular destination is the geographically closest state of Hawaii, where an estimated 9,000 Marshallese currently live. 44% of these are 14 years of age or under, a further 33% aged between 25 and 44. While COFA migrants are entitled to education and housing, other rights, for example, accessing the healthcare system or the right to vote, are not necessarily extended to Marshallese born outside the US. The state of Hawaii has appealed to Congress for adequate funding to support the influx of migrants, but has received little additional aid. As a result of overburdened resources and services, many Marshallese, as well as other Micronesians, have become stigmatized in the media, live in abject poverty, and suffer daily discrimination. So I think it's quite important for us to understand why people leave the Marshall Islands. There is no comprehensive research on this, but reasons stem back to two important aspects of life in contemporary RMI, Republic of the Marshall Islands. The first are hardships suffered as a result of overcrowding, which are a direct result of the nuclear testing legacy, and the continued use of the Marshall Islands for US military and strategic purposes. And the second is displacement as a result of climate change. Anthropologist and activist Holly Barker has noted that everyone knows at least one Marshallese word, and it's for all the wrong reasons. That word is bikini. In Marshallese, it means the sand in which the coconut grows and is the name of one of the northernmost and remote atolls of the Marshall Islands. We, of course, have an altogether different association with it. Bikini Atoll was the site of 23 out of the 67 atomic and thermonuclear weapons tested by the United States government during 1946 and 1958. The largest and dirtiest of which was the Castle Bravo detonation on March 1st, 1954. The 167 Bikini Islanders living there at the time had been persuaded that the tests for which they were leaving their homeland were, quote, for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. The bomb was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic bomb and 2.5 times stronger than was expected. As a result, the fallout from this test also fell on two other northern atolls, Rongelap and Uterik, to which in the case of the former, many Bikini Islanders had been moved. These atolls were evacuated 3 days after the bomb, and controversy has surrounded this decision ever since. So it's been argued that the US government knew that the wind was blowing over those inhabited atolls and simply decided to continue with the test. The fact that US scientists subsequently took advantage of this situation to experiment on and test victims of fallout, what became known as Project 4.1, is well documented in official reports and films. In 1972, Bikini Islanders were resettled, only to be moved again, this time to the small and inhospitable islands of Kili and Ejit in 1978, when radiation levels were revealed to be too high. Bikini is still deemed to be uninhabitable for possibly thousands of years. So this is our association with the Bikini. So in 1946, 4 days after nuclear tests had begun at Bikini Atoll, the French designer Louis Réard revealed this new design in swimwear, the bikini bathing suit. The swimsuit was supposed to be metaphorically explosive and was named after the atoll. The testing in the Marshall Islands has severely damaged the health of nuclear fallout survivors and their descendants. So these communities are rife with cancers, birth defects, and other hereditary diseases at levels that are far higher than those in unexposed Marshallese communities. In addition, Marshallese today are faced with urban overcrowding in southern atolls, the depletion of their natural resources, a dependence on imported Western food, so like tinned and canned food like Spam and Campbell's soups and things like that, and a poor health and education infrastructure. A further displacement occurred when the US used the island of Kwajalein as a preparation base for its nuclear tests in the northern atolls in the 1940s, and where it has recently established the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Testing Center. So that's the image at the kind of top, where you can see the satellites and the kind of golf ball things there. That's Kwajalein Base Missile Testing Center. Many of the displaced Kwajalein Islanders were moved to the neighboring and now severely overcrowded island of Ibai. So that's the bottom picture there. Which has been nicknamed the slum of the Pacific. These further issues of displacement have resulted in an increase in both infectious diseases and chronic diseases like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. The Compact of Free Association established a $150 million fund to compensate the Marshallese for damage done by the nuclear testing program. In exchange, the Marshall Islanders had to abandon various lawsuits that they had brought against the US government, and to agree to the continued use of Kwajalein as a military base and ballistic missile testing range. In 1977, about 4,000 US servicemen were sent to clean up as many of the islands as they could. And over a 3 to 4 year period, they put about 85,000 cubic meters of radioactive soil and debris into a small crater left behind by one of the blasts, and then capped it with a concrete dome about 1.5 feet thick. This is the Rinut Dome on Eniwetok Atoll, which you can see in the picture on the right. And that Eniwetok was the site of further nuclear testing in the Cold War period, and where the evacuated population were actually resettled in the 1980s, so there are people living there now. However, there is a further problem, rising sea levels due to climate change. The dome was built on the shoreline on the ocean side of the island. The Marshall Islands are one of the lowest lying island nations in the world, with an average height above sea level of 6 feet, so that's somewhere between 1 and 2 meters. Because groundwater levels have risen, the salt water is penetrating the underside of the dome, which wasn't lined due to cost considerations at the time, and threatening to leak radioactive waste into the surrounding waters. In 2013, a report also stated that the dome could be torn apart by the increasing ferocity of storms. So the other big issue affecting the Marshall Islands today is climate change. The Marshall Islands is one of the 4 island nations. The others are nearby Tuvalu, Kiribati, and in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives, that are in danger of disappearing if the world warms up by 2 degrees centigrade. So rising sea levels will cause, again, mass displacement and migration. The photo on the slide there is one that I took from the airplane as we were coming in to land on Majuro Atoll. Majuro is the capital of the Marshall Islands. And I think that just gives you a really good sense of what tiny slivers of land they are. And there's 28,000 people, that's half of the population of the Marshall Islands, living on that piece of land there. And just one last kind of background slide about the Marshall Islands economy. So their main income comes from the United States in compact sector grants, so it's under the COFA. And these are gradually decreasing until they end in 2023, I should say. And also they pay them a lease on Kwajalein Island, and plus they provide a lot of direct aid, the United States do. The government of Marshall Islands also sell fishing rights. So a lot of those kind of ships you could see from above that are in the lagoon and Majuro, they're not Marshallese ships, they are Taiwanese and ships coming from other places who have bought rights to fish in Marshallese waters. They have also started to register ships, so they have some income from that. There's quite a big tuna processing plant in Majuro, so that it employs a reasonable number of people. There is copra production, so copra cake and coconut oil, which are the largest exports of the Marshall Islands, but these have to be subsidised by the government, and they're very, very small. There's some retail and restaurants in urban centres. The Marshall Islands government is the biggest employer, so 30% or more people work for the government. There's some subsistence economy, so banana, breadfruit, taro, fishing, etc., and copra and handicrafts for cash. A huge number of goods are imported, and there's hardly any tourism. So unlike many Pacific islands and the Marshall Islands, there's hardly any tourism for reasons that you can imagine, maybe partly to do with the nuclear legacy. I mean, there's just no infrastructure for tourism there at all. There are a few hotels in Majuro and Ibai, but it's people like me who stay in them, or people working for the World Bank, or coming in to do certain kinds of work and things like that. There's some high-end tourism. I think you can go diving in Bikini Atoll. You can't live on Bikini Atoll, but you can dive into the lagoon and look at the wrecks of kind of airplanes and ships and things that were sunk there when the testing took place. So that was my just background to the Marshall Islands, and it was partly just to explain the situation there and to lay out the context to help us kind of understand the rest of the. Oh, there's someone in the lobby. Okay. So in this bit, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my own research project. So my work is largely in arts education, and the project that I worked on began with an AHRC GCRF forced displacement grant, which was awarded in 2016 for an 18-month period, alongside Professor Michelle Kewen from the English Literature Department here at the University of Edinburgh. The specific remit of this award was an exploration of people's experience of forced displacement as a direct result of conflict. And because of this, our project focused on populations historically displaced in the RMI as a result of the legacy of nuclear testing, what Rob Nixon has called the slow violence of nuclear imperialism, rather than the more recent displacements that have been taking place because of climate change. So this included displaced populations and their descendants from Bikini Atoll, those displaced to Kwajalein Atoll because of nuclear contamination on inhabited atolls such as Rongelap, which were close to Bikini, and the establishment of the US military base, resulting in the displacement of Marshallese people to Ibai. We worked with populations in Eniwetok Atoll, where further nuclear tests were carried out and where the Rinuk Dome is located. We also worked with Marshallese groups in Honolulu, Hawaii, who had moved to the US under the terms of the COFA, a policy which is an attempt at reparation for damages caused by the nuclear testing. And these people were in Honolulu seeking what they imagined would be a better life. Because our research was focused on school-aged children, we employed predominantly arts-based methodologies and conducted most of our research in collaboration with artist educators across the sites that I've just spoken about. So this table here sort of illustrates some of the workshops that we did. So we worked with Cathy Jetnall-Kitchener, the Marshallese poet that I began the presentation with. She conducted poetry writing workshops with children across some of these schools. We've got 2 published books of children's poems that we've produced, and we've got copies of these, and they've all gone back to those kids in those schools. The poems are data exploring displacement. They are also teaching resources that can be used in the school, and they're, for the children and the families to keep. We also worked with a Hawaiian multimedia artist based in Honolulu, Solomon Enos, and he worked with 3 schools designing murals and painting them. In one school, we painted them on shipping containers. In another school, in the school in Honolulu, we painted it on the outside of the school wall. In Egypt, where there are displaced Bikini Islander descendants, we painted a mural on the wall of the school itself. And again, the murals and the mural making process are kind of data for us. And we also worked with Christine Germano. She's a Canadian photographer who'd worked with Indigenous populations displaced in the past, especially in the Pacific with children displaced because of climate change. And she did a photo voice project with the children, produced books of photos. There was an exhibition. Again, this is kind of a form of data, but also something that fed back into the community. We had a filmmaker, researcher that we worked with who's made some short artist educator interviews and films. A part of our project was also about commissioning new creative works. So Cathy Jetnall-Kitchener wrote a new poem called Monster. Solomon Enos we all did some research on, specifically actually he did a graphic novel. Cathy's poem Monster is in the graphic novel, but it's also about canoes and navigation. So Solomon's graphic novel is called Jerak Irlap, which means point of no return. It's a Marshall Islands epic. So this slide shows you some photos I took while we were doing the workshops, and some of the murals that we painted and some of these publications. So the data was poetry, murals, photographs, drawings. And in addition, my job was also to research the creative methodologies that we were using. So I spent time observing and speaking to the artists involved. I also observed some classroom teaching, interviewed some of the teachers we worked with, as well as officials at the Ministry of Education and representatives from local education-centred NGOs. The research outputs were deliberately formulated to feed back into the communities themselves. So we produced and published, as I said, comic book versions of Cathy's poetry, a graphic novel, teaching resources, murals that are in the school grounds, poetry, photo exhibition, etc. And more recently, we were able to fund the travel and stay of 5 teachers from the Marshall Islands to Edinburgh. So you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, their visit coincided with those school climate change protests down at Scottish Parliament. So I took them down there. We made all these signs. Michelle and I took our children as well with us, and we went down to Scottish Parliament with the Marshall Islanders, and one of them also did a radio interview, and they visited schools around Scotland talking about climate change in the Marshall Islands. Various other grants helped us to build on initial work by running further workshops with children in eBay on animation and filmmaking. So the images you see on the left there are both of the filmmaking workshops that they did with a local, he's a US but local Marshallese filmmaker called Jack Needenthal. He's a US expat who's married to a Marshallese woman, has lived there for a long time. He makes Marshallese language films with the community, just using kind of phones. And this was a film that those kids made. They scripted and made it. And then that was the top there in the middle is a canoe kind of workshop that we also had organised. And I've been working on, I was just telling Will at the beginning, I've been working on writing curriculum aligned schemes of work for the Marshall Islands curriculum and for the Hawaii Board of Education. They have a unit called Pacific Island Studies, using some of the resources that we've made and aligning them with the curriculum. And then I've just made loads of worksheets and activities and things like that that teachers can use. And my plan was to go back to both Honolulu and to the Marshall Islands and take the scheme of work, try it out, talk to teachers, do professional development workshops, but that's on hold at the moment because of COVID. So these, I've kind of probably done this all in the wrong order, but these were our original research questions from the project. I won't read them out, but and I'm not going to discuss the outcomes or findings of the project in a huge amount of detail. But I will just say something about the importance that land has to Marshallese identity. And in this sense, I think because we were trying to explore what it means to be displaced, and what it means to be displaced if you're a Marshall Islander obviously has something to do with the nuclear legacy, but what land means to people. So as Senator Jeton Anajoin of Rongelap Atoll has said, remember Rongelap was not evacuated in 1954, but it was contaminated by fallout from the Bravo shot. He explained to a US congressional committee in 1985 that land ownership is uniquely significant under Marshallese custom. The ownership of land is vested in the family, including in unborn generations. Landless people are outcasts, second-class citizens. When my people of Rongelap and others like us are uprooted from our traditional islands, the fabric of our social structure is torn. Our lands are unreplaceable and without price. There are no comparable sales, since there are no sales. So in fact, when we visited Edgett Elementary School, and Edgett Elementary School is the photo you see there of the boys, some of the boys who were in the school who we worked with. They are direct descendants of Bikini Islanders. So the Bikini Islanders were resettled on Bikini Atoll and then moved again because it was still too contaminated, and they were moved either to Edgett or to Kili. So these are the descendants of people who were moved to Edgett. None of the children we work with had ever been to Bikini, but they looked at photos of it on the internet and things like that. So when we visited this school, we were quite surprised to see that they still carried the image of that violent rupture from their own land. And you can see the middle image is of the school T-shirt. So when I spoke to the principal about it, she said orange, like their T-shirt, reminds them of the Bravo shot. So the Bravo shot is obviously the image there on the left, the explosion. When it exploded, it was like an orange light. So it reminds them of how the bomb exploded in the area of Bikini, and the design is a reminiscence of the first day of the bomb. So this is a kind of like a collective memory that they carry around. And the image on the back of their T-shirts is of a mushroom cloud rising out of the Bible, which is draped in the Marshallese flag. And above it in white are the words Men Otemjej Reg Elo Pain Anij, which means everything is in the hands of God. The design, the principal explained, was adopted so that the children never forget where they come from and why they are no longer there. Every March the 1st, she said, they will remember that it was the day that it happened. Everything is in the hands of God is the response that Chief Judah is reported to have given when Commodore Ben Wyatt asked him if the Bikini people would be willing to leave their island so nuclear testing could begin for the good of mankind. I've written about this and this mural, the mural we painted. So you can see the girls there on the chairs painting the mural at Edger Elementary School. And they also wanted to paint the Bravo shot explosion onto the mural. So I've written about this and the mural that we painted in Honolulu. And I've focused on the participatory arts workshops and how they helped us understand the unique qualities of Marshallese displacement, both nationally and internationally. So the reference to that article is at the end of my slides, but I think it was on the previous slide for some reason. Sorry, just under there, but I can send the article if anyone's interested. So I'm going to stop there because I'm not going to talk any more about my research, but I was going to go on to discuss the education system in the Marshall Islands generally and to address some of the themes of this project, which are access to secondary education. I'm happy to stop briefly if anyone's got any questions, or I can just carry on and we can have questions at the end. I don't know what's best.
Shari, that's up to you. I think if you want to continue on, if anybody has questions, you're obviously free to unmute and ask them now or add them to the chat box.
Okay. Well, I'll just plow on then. So the education overview. So this kind of slide, slightly kind of different, a change to the tone of things, but I wanted to try and think through some of the questions that this particular project about access to secondary education in the Asia Pacific region was asking. So some background to the Marshall Islands education system. The Marshall Islands, there's just some important points really, are that education is compulsory for children aged 5 to 18 in the Marshall Islands. Education is free. So the registration fee for schools was suspended in 2013. All children who complete primary education are eligible to enroll in secondary education. The education system is the kind of K to 12, kindergarten to grade 12, and it's based on the US model. And so you can see in the in that kind of chart there the way it maps onto the international standard classification of education. We were talking about that last time. So secondary school in the Marshall Islands is basically would be the equivalent of upper secondary school according to those classifications. Schools are highly dependent on imported textbooks. So some of those come from the US. A lot of the science and maths textbooks are coming from Asia, places like Singapore. But this is kind of beginning to change because there are local NGOs working on producing kind of Marshallese texts and texts specific to the curriculum. This is one of the reasons why we wanted our project to produce stuff that could be used in schools, I suppose, resources that could be used in schools. There are a large number of schools in the Marshall Islands, so there's about 112 schools. And this is really a result of the fact that it's such a spread out scattering of remote islands. And some of the places in the Marshall Islands still don't really have internet connectivity, and some places don't really have great electricity either. There are 86 public schools, 26 private schools, and the private schools are mostly church schools. 17 of these are high schools, 95 of them are kind of primary elementary schools. And about 55 of these 112 schools are concentrated on 3 specific atolls, which are the most crowded, so Majuro, Kwajalein, and Arno. There's only 1 private school in a rural area, that's on Jaluit Atoll, and all schools are part of the Marshall Islands School Accreditation System, or the Western Association of School Accreditation, which is US-based. There are 2 public tertiary education institutions. There's the College of the Marshall Islands and the University of the South Pacific. Some some of these primary schools, by the way, that are spread out are very, very small. So about 50% of them are very, very small and have fewer than 8 teachers, and they tend to teach in multi-grade classrooms. So there's a comprehensive standards-based national curriculum for all core subjects. That's Marshallese, language arts, English language arts, math, social studies, health and science. There are Marshallese standard assessment tests. They're called the MISATs, and they're used as the main summative assessment, and they are administered at the end of grades 3, 6, 8, 10, and 12. So in grades 3 and 6, you get English, reading, Marshallese, reading, and maths. And in grade 8, that's essentially the high school entrance test. So you have the same tests, but you also get tested in science and social studies. And then in grades 10 and 12, it's English and mathematics. So these are all assessed according to benchmark levels of advanced, proficient, developing, and beginning. There's absolutely no arts curriculum in schools at all. So that was another reason why we did our project through the arts. But I'll come back to that a bit later. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the challenges are for the Marshall Islands in terms of education. And this is the kind of statistic bit that I'm not too sure about, but I've drawn some of the data from the Marshall Islands have their own education digest, their own way of collecting data. And I've drawn some of it from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics data. But the Marshall Islands one is based on a annual school census. So it's not entirely reliable, but I think it's kind of getting better. And they have an app as well. The app is that kind of does statistics. I didn't really use that because it was a little bit it was incomplete, shall we say. So these, I think, are the main challenges for the Marshall Islands. So we've got challenges with teachers' qualifications and their professional development. So only about 10% of teachers actually have a 4-year bachelor's degree. And most of them are at the Associate of Arts or Science diploma level or even lower, which is basic qualification for teaching in the Marshall Islands. Only very basic teacher education is actually available in the Marshall Islands, and there isn't a huge amount of in-service opportunity, in-service training for teachers. If you want to get a bachelor's degree, essentially, in teaching, you would have to leave the Marshall Islands and then come back. Another problem is that the best qualified teachers are also the oldest, and that Marshall Islands does depend to a great extent, particularly at secondary level, on retired teachers from Fiji coming over to the Marshall Islands and working there. And they used to depend quite a lot on volunteer teachers coming from places like the US. So through the World Teach Programme, the Dartmouth Volunteer Teaching Programme. I think the World Teach is now being suspended, but that's a mixture of unqualified and qualified teachers from abroad. So I met a whole mixture of different kinds of there was a UK teacher I met who was actually working at Edget. She was a qualified teacher. She was there for a year. But I suppose the point is they go for a year and then they leave. So just to give you a sense, there's about 40 teachers in the year 2012 to 13. There was about 40 teachers overall that were placed, non-Marshallese teachers from abroad, just there for a year. So this is the bar chart showing the levels of qualifications. So the teachers that are qualified with an Associate of Arts or Science, and those that are certified. So you can see clearly there that the older teachers are the best qualified, I guess. Secondary teachers are marginally better qualified than primary teachers. Another big problem there is that school enrolment is on the decline. So again, you can see that the primary school enrolment isn't great. The secondary school enrolment's pretty bad. So the differences between male and female students is actually quite marginal. So their gender parity in the Marshall Islands is not too bad, but I'll come back to that as well. But in secondary education, the difference does increase between boys and girls, meaning that girls tend to stay in school longer than boys. in early childhood education, and the net enrolment ratio falls below 40% of the population. And nearly the same situation is true for secondary. So these are kind of 2020 figures here. So participation in education 2020, the Marshall Islands saying was generally quite low. But essentially, big problems are getting children into the education system and also children graduating out of the education system as well. So the enrolment in primary is falling. In secondary, it's quite sort of stable. So this is another big problem. Is I guess when we're thinking about access to secondary education, also thinking particularly about kind of upper primary or what would be lower secondary in the international classification system. Quite a lot of kids are beginning to drop out of school. Obviously, that's something related to the assessments as well, so we'll think about those in a bit. The out-of-school rates are really high. So in primary, the most recent value is 20. So you've got 25.9% of children out of school. The regional average, that's for the region of Oceania, according to UIS, is 5.03. So that's kind of slightly distorted because they include Australia and New Zealand in that regional average. The lower secondary out of school rate is 30.9%. And then again, the regional average is 5.43. The upper secondary out of school rate is 43.1%. This is just to give you a sense of what's happening in the Marshall Islands. So the dates here are slightly different, but the regional average is basically falling, whereas for out of school upper secondary school children, whereas in the Marshall Islands it's actually going up. So the Marshall Islands, I'm just trying to think what MIEMIS stands for. I've blacked it out now, but Marshall Islands Education Management Information System, I think, has noted that there's an alarming increasing pattern in out-of-school numbers of both males and females for primary. Another big problem is the low student attainment. So the blue bar charts there you'll see is the MISAT 3, that's the grade 8 high school entrance test. So the percentage of students achieving proficiency is generally below 50%. This year, in 2020, it was really low. The only MISAT that was delivered in the 2019-2020 school year in the Marshall Islands was the MISAT 3, this grade 8 one. They cancelled all the other exams because of COVID. And you can see that the attainment on that fell quite dramatically. The coloured bar chart on the right shows you the percentage of students who have proficiency across specific subjects. So you can see proficiency in, I don't know how clear this is to you, sorry, but the proficiency in science and social studies is very, very low. And you know, they continue to test students in those subjects in grade 8, even though they have big problems finding science and social studies teachers in the Marshall Islands. And just to, I guess that the text up there above the coloured bar chart is just to say that attainment is kind of low all the way through school. So only 20% of 6th graders actually meet or exceed proficiency levels in mathematics, while 19% meet or exceed proficiency levels in reading. So that's data from the Asian Development Bank, who are doing a project on improving the quality of basic education. The Marshall Islands also measure something called the access rate and graduation rates for secondary. So the access rates, I can tell you how all these are calculated if you're interested. I do have notes on them, but the access rates for 2020 are showing a steady decline in people accessing secondary education. And then the graduation rate for 2020, so in primary, they've got about 75% of students graduating, in secondary, 45%, but that's of the cohort who started together in grade 1. So this is the way that they calculate their kind of survival rates through school for 2020. So generally, the survival rates are considered to be low, and the Marshall Islands government is very aware of the fact that this is a big problem, that school persistence is a huge problem. They think that these stats are much lower because of, I mean, in November 2019, or sort of earlier even, they had a big outbreak of dengue fever, and then COVID hit. It hasn't literally hit the Marshall Islands badly at all, but there was a huge amount of disruption to people's lives, but also funds coming in. The survival rates are slightly higher for girls than for boys. 80% of girls compared to 60% of boys survive to grade 8. 33% of girls compared to 23% of boys survive to grade 12. And of those that survive to grade 9, so grade 9 is the first grade of high school, secondary school, 64% of girls and 59% of boys make it to grade 12. So what are the barriers then to accessing, I've said, upper secondary education? So one of the big problems, I think, is the geography of the Marshall Islands and issues like transportation, board, and food. So the population distribution is you know, people are scattered all over these atolls, even though some of them are highly crowded. There are only 2 high schools in the outer islands, and they are on Jaluit Atoll, which is in the kind of, you might be able to see just sort of diagonally across from Majuro towards the left there, Jaluit. That's one of the high schools. The other high school is up on the Ratak chain at Watja, which is about halfway up your picture there. So if you lived, you know, quite far away, and we're talking huge distances here, it's very difficult for you to get to secondary school. You would either have to go by boat or you would have to fly. Those are the only 2 ways of getting there. And it's expensive and it's difficult. There's also an issue about capacity. So boarding facilities, there aren't enough boarding facilities in secondary schools. And the other thing is that if you attend one of these high schools, you would have to either board or you would have to live with a family nearby. And this places a burden on other relatives. So if you happen to have relatives living on Jaluit or Watja or in Majuro or Kwajalein, and you send your child there, then they have to live with those. Oh, something's happened. Sorry, I don't know what happened to the slides there. I'll try and bring those back. Yeah, so you would end up living with either some distant member of your own family, and you would be highly reliant on them for food and board. So it would make things really quite difficult. So I have to wait for that. So that's one of the biggest barriers, I think, is the and I've tried to find out from a contact in the Ministry of Education about whether the government financially supports students to attend secondary school, whether they pay for them to travel there or not. And also, I don't think they have any meals provided when they're at school, so they don't have a free school meal system. I think those sorts of things would probably help try and encourage school participation. I noticed when I was there, we were doing workshops. One really good way of making sure that people came to the workshops that we were doing was by providing food. And whenever we went to any of the schools, we would always take food with us. Sorry, we'll have to scoot through. I think we were here. So I've just put an excerpt from a quotation from somebody from the Ministry of Education that I interviewed when I was there in May 2017, who said that sometimes they go hungry during lunch hour. There's really nobody to take care of them. And it's not because they don't have family here, it's just that they can't afford a lot. They have their own kids to look after. And having to bring more into the house, it puts a burden on the family. Another barrier, I guess, would be internal migration and overcrowding. So people migrating to urban areas such as Majuro, as I said, population 28,000, or Ibai, population about 10,000. People are going there for work or opportunity. So people go to Ibai because if you're Marshallese, you can get work on Kwajalein military base. You go over there in a boat, do your job during the day, and then you come back. You can't stay there because it's a protected military area, security, but Marshallese can work there. So people tend to go to Ibai because they can get jobs. So these areas are overcrowded. The schools are overcrowded. There's not enough classrooms. There's not enough teachers. There's general overcrowding and multiple families living in houses. So people in Majuro and Ibai actually sleep in shifts because there's too many people living in each house. There's not enough space. And I remember when I was on Ibai, all night you would see kids, school-age kids, all night in the street. And I remember saying, well, what are they doing here? And somebody said, oh, well, their parents are sleeping because their parents have to go to work the next day. They get priority. They sleep and the children are awake. So the children end up going to school, tired and hungry, basically. So another big issue is student well-being and lack of systems to support them. So there's a teenage pregnancy issue in the Marshall Islands. It's got the highest rates in the Pacific region, so 85 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. There's a substance abuse issue. There's ill health and nutrition and diet, as I think I've already hinted at. They do have a problem with suicide and attempted suicide, especially amongst young men. There are kind of lack of in-school systems and policies and staff to support students. So to keeping those children in school, especially adolescent children, they just don't have the kinds of the structures or the systems to keep them there. And there's a lack of motivation. So a lot of the children would say things like, this was somebody else I was interviewing, and he told me that they would say to him, I want to drop out. I have nothing to look forward to past graduation. So they don't see that there's anything for them, even if they make it through high school. What would they end up doing? So this is just taken from my interview with the executive director of a local NGO called Youth to Youth and Health. He said that the school truancy rate is really bad. There's no parental support. I've seen a lot of bad things happening at the schools where some schools are changing now, but if they're 2 months pregnant, they're kicked out of school. And then a lot of kids are being kicked out now for substance abuse or drinking. And even in the middle school, drinking and doing drugs, they just kick them out. They don't refer them to us or refer them to anything, or they don't call the parent or work with these people. They just kick them out. So it's like something's breaking along the way. And so he said, some of my staff will go in and teach the curriculum and they're like, oh, where's this kid? Oh, he was fired. For what? Oh, he was caught smoking. We hear after the fact, we don't hear before. So it's really hard to try to reach out to those kids once they're out of school. But I don't know what would change that. He also talked about boredom. So he said that a lot of these kids, their only thing to do outside school, outside the house, is to go to school. And then they come back, they've got to raise their younger siblings, or their parents, or you're going to take care of your grandma and grandpa, or you have to cook, or you have to do this. And then the minute they have something free, it's usually at night when nothing is happening. So that's when they dabble into drinking and substance abuse and experiencing with sex, and there's no one to oversee them or watch them. So mostly it's because of boredom. And I fear that it's only going to get worse, because if what I heard from NTA is the National Telecommunications Agency, is right, they're going to force people to go on to 4G, which they have done, which is way too expensive for a lot of these households to afford. So if they're not on their iPads or phones or Facebook and Messenger, that's going to leave them a lot more time to do nothing. I think this is a real problem in the Marshall Islands, because if you're a teenager, for example, there's nothing to do other than, you can go swimming and hang out with your friends and stuff like that. There are no cinemas, there's no leisure facilities, there's absolutely nothing like that at all. So another issue is out-migration to the United States. So as I said, families are kind of leaving en masse, and quite often in the middle of school years, and there's no cross data. So the last population census was in 2011, excuse me, and they don't really keep track of who is leaving the country. A lot of teachers leave to go to the US. Graduates from high schools often end up going to the College of the Marshall Islands or USP, and then they go to USP in Fiji, or they go to the United States, they go to the University of Hawaii at Hilo. There's an arrangement between them and the College of the Marshall Islands for further study. And because they can live in the US, they tend not to come back. So the Ministry of Education source said most of them don't come back. And I wonder if this kind of discourages some families from sending their children to high school, because if you do send your child to high school and they do well and they graduate, then the likelihood is they're not going to stay in the Marshall Islands. The MySats, I think, are a barrier as well, because they enable progression through grades. So it's the American system, whereas if you fail a grade, you repeat the grade. And as one of my other informants, Alison Kalen, said to me, if you don't pass, that's the end. That's education. That's the end of education for you. So that's why that's one of the reasons we have the youngest, population in the world. We have kids making kids. So he's referencing the teenage pregnancy issue again, and raising them on coconut oil. So some of the teachers also told me that the parents of the children in the school were also just children. And so this causes obviously other issues and engagements with education. So students are tested repeatedly, grades 3, 6, 8, 10, 12. Seems like a lot of testing. The MySat includes subjects like social studies and science, as I said, where there is a shortage of qualified teachers. I mean, the standards, in sitting down doing the schemes of work, I was writing a scheme of work for grade 8 because I was trying to fit it into the Asian Development Bank's project. They're doing a project on the quality of primary education, and they had lesson plan templates, and I was trying to fit it into those. And aligning things with the curriculum, I was thinking, I can align these with the curriculum, but this is not a reflection of what I've seen in the classroom of grade 8 students that I've seen in the classroom. So in a sense, those kind of benchmarks are setting up those students to fail. So this was, I guess, a sort of general thing of what I thought maybe the key barriers are. I mean, I've talked about most of these. This is just sort of putting them all onto one slide. The things that maybe I haven't talked about is the lack of options in terms of vocational training, or, if you're not going to take the academic route, what can you do? That I think that needs to be worked on. Will, I tried to fit it into your table, your kind of barrier category table. So that's kind of my attempt at trying to do that. I haven't put anything into the kind of political barriers there. And just to finish off, what is the government or the public school system doing? So they have suspended registration fees for schools. They've increased teachers' salaries. They've gone up from $8,000 to $15,000 if you're associate, or $21,000 if you're bachelor's degree. Still obviously not comparable with a teacher's salary in the States. They've involved something called Manic Week. Manic means culture, and that's a way of involving local communities and engaging parents in schooling. They have a bilingual language policy, so the language of instruction from kindergarten to 6 is Marshallese, but English language is taught throughout. Then English is introduced as the language of instruction. There is no policy discrimination against pregnant teenage girls staying in school, but the practice, as we've heard, is different. They've established something called the Life Skills Academy as a kind of different option from the academic route of secondary education. They've introduced catch-up years, so there's a pre-grade 9 year at post-secondary level. They're trying to address poor internet and mobile connectivity through the high prices, and trying to see what the education sector can get. But they could provide financial support for children and families to attend school, as I've said, like free school meals, transportation. They could be building more dormitories for secondary schools. They could be increasing pastoral support within schools to prevent dropping out. They could reassess the MySAPs as a barrier, particularly the need for social studies and science at MySAP 3. They could construct inclusive or accessible facilities in schools. I haven't talked about that much, but they could also develop and strengthen existing alternative and equivalent education, e.g. skills, vocational. And they could think about introducing career counselling and pathways for students, because where students are going and what they could do with their qualifications is extremely unclear. So these are some current projects that are running in the Marshall Islands that, to some extent, are addressing some of these issues. And my last bit was that these are just some local grassroots NGOs that support youth that are not in school. So Youth to Youth and Health, this is where I drew my interview data from. They have an arts training program for out of school youth and they do health education with schools. So at the top right there, you'll see that's Henry. He's an artist. He teaches children to paint, and then they sell their paintings. And then there's a great organisation called the One Elon in Majel, Canoes of the Marshall Islands, set up by Elson Kalin. And these are all school dropout kids that come to him, and they get English, maths, and life skills lessons in the morning. So you can see on the far left there, they're in a big building. They have their lesson in the morning, and then in the afternoon, the next two pictures, they build canoes. And in the process of building canoes, they learn carpentry, they learn geometry, and part of this is that they go back. It's partly carrying on the Marshallese tradition of canoes and navigation. They also sail the canoes that they build, but it's also kind of tied to sustainability as well, and going back to life on outer islands and what you might do if you're there. Okay, so that's me. I've taken an hour. I'm really sorry about that. Those are my key references. And that's just in case you have any questions. So I will take my slides off. There we go.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Shari. We're a very small group here, so I just want to encourage anybody with questions to either add it to the chat box or even raise your hand, share a video, and we'll just have a nice conversation together. And Shari, while people are waiting for a second and maybe formulating their questions, as you know, I'm very interested in assessment, and so wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the high school entrance exam, and what is that? I guess, how is that stratifying society? Is that really, when I was looking at this in Uganda, for instance, there were levels that would allow access to kind of public secondary. There are levels that would allow no access to any secondary. And then there are levels that would allow access to kind of like the elites. And so wondering, the high school entrance exam, I know that was one of the reasons that I was interested in this project in the Asia Pacific, because it seemed to be a common practice. But what does that look like in the Marshall Islands when somebody doesn't do well? Is there options? Is it really a firm denial to secondary education?
I think that's a really good question. I don't have a straightforward answer to it. As I said, I've been trying for the last week to actually contact someone in the Marshall Islands. He would be able to help me. He was one of the teachers that came over here, and he is the kind of deputy commissioner for secondary education in the Ministry of Education. And we haven't been able to actually chat because of differences, and there's like a 12-hour difference. But so those are questions that I was going to put to him. I don't know. I imagine there isn't a huge amount of consistency in what is done across all the different schools. I think one of the big challenges in the Marshall Islands is because the schools are so spread out. It's very difficult to have an overview of what exactly is going on in the large number of schools, I guess. High schools, the introduction of this pre-grade 9 year, I guess, is there to address this issue of if you fail, that's it. You're not going to go to secondary school. But I just think it's so much, I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting also to find out, to disaggregate the data and find out, for example, what's going on in the private schools, because they're taking the MISATs as well. Are those students more likely to go to secondary? Are they doing, better than the other students? I don't know. I don't have that information. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think my answer to your question is a good question, but I don't know. I don't know. And I imagine it's quite inconsistent. And I think they're only just beginning to discover some of these issues. But I think that the need to have standardized tests is so obviously there has to be standards, and they're assessed all the time by the funding, that their funding comes from the US. So I remember once I was talking to somebody about kind of school inspections and standards inspections and things like that. And she said, oh, the US, sometimes it's the US teachers, the US kind of inspectorate that coming around assessing, what's going on in Marshall Islands classrooms. So, I mean, there are kind of political, so this would be one for the political barriers, I guess. There are kind of political pressures to do with where the funding is coming from, and the way in which schools and the education system is constantly being held to account for, what it's doing for its funding, that will be playing into why those tests exist. I mean, that's a lot of testing that those kids are being put through. And like I say, my feeling when I was sitting down writing like a grade 8, scheme of work was, I'm aligning it with the standards, but these standards are not the standards of the children I've seen in grade 8. So if you're going to assess them with these standards, you're setting them up to fail. I mean, it's just really complicated, I guess, with the teaching and everything else, and kids just not having basic. Some of those kids just not being fed, and just being tired, and coming to school, or not having study space and stuff like that. I mean, how can you go home and do your homework when you're sleeping in shifts with your family? But yeah, I mean, not all households are like that, and I don't have enough of a sense of kind of the social. I mean, interestingly, there was one school that we worked in, which was called the cooperative, and it was a school that was set up by expats living in the Marshall Islands, and that felt like a completely different space, because practically all the teachers were from the US. The principal was from the US. They I don't think they even did the Marshall Islands test. They did all the US exams and stuff. But and it was full of, there were some Marshallese kids in there, but it was the kind of expat kids school. It wasn't expensive. I mean, it's private, but it's like $25 a month or something like that. And then if kids were really poor or they were on scholarships, some of the teachers would sponsor the children. So they would help pay their school fees, or they would pay for their school lunches and things like that. So that was a different thing, because all the teachers were qualified according to US standards. That was a kind of different one. So a lot of the rich kids, I suppose what would count as the rich kids of the Marshall Islands, were in that school. But then they weren't doing the same exams.
Thanks, Shari. You've got a question from Zarina in the chat box.
Okay. If life condition is so poor, what motivates parents to stop or discourage children from doing well at school? Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a good question. It's kind of complicated, because on the one hand, yes, you want your children to do well, but if you're staying in the Marshall Islands, you may not want them to leave, because so it's a complicated situation. And I suppose it's the same in lots of places around the world, that actually doing well at school means event and being in a country in which there's nothing for you to do when you graduate, or there's not much alignment between the jobs that are available and the skills that people are coming out of school with, you know, that children will leave. And actually, I think what's happening is there's a bigger issue about kind of what's happened to Marshallese culture and heritage and Marshallese ways of life. Because actually, if you live on an outer island in the Marshall Islands, what do you need to go to school for anyway? You know, if you're going to go back to the outer islands and you're going to do what, you know, some of these kids are doing, like maybe build a canoe, or do something, or do copra, or whatever it is on the island, why do you need to have gone to high school? And why do you need to have taken that academic route? Just as like the migration as well, that if people are going to the US, they tend to leave, they often tend to go as, sometimes they send their kids if they've got other family in the US. Sometimes the whole family just ups and leaves. So there are areas, like somebody was telling me that there's 2 areas in Majuro, one called Laura, one called Rita. They were named after Lauren Bacall and Rita Hayworth. The Americans named those places. And Laura, there's a big high school in Laura, and one of the teachers working there said, you know, one year it was like so many kids just left. They just, you know, they didn't come back to school. And I said, what happened? He said, well, they went to the US. So they just get the money, they get on the plane, and they go there. I think what was really sad for us is that those children living in Honolulu, children in Marshall Islands living in poverty, etc., yes, but those children living in Honolulu were much worse off. You know, they were not better off. They were having a much worse life than the ones that had stayed behind. Julia, does that answer your question a bit, Sarina? Okay, thanks. So Julia's question is the map of the shells and sticks represents an informal, unstructured other way of learning. Gaining a different way. Sorry, Mum. I'm in the middle of a presentation. Sorry, that's a 9-year-old child wanting me to approve more time on the iPad. Yeah, Julia, I mean, I think that's right. I think that, well, the stick chart is we use it in our Anthropology of Education course as an example of formal, informal training. So that the stick chart was used, it wasn't a map, so you didn't take it on the canoe with you. It didn't help you navigate, but it was used as an educational tool to teach you about currents and swells in the ocean. And you would leave the stick chart behind, and then you'd get on your canoe and go. So I think that kind of knowledge or ways of learning that you're talking about, yes, they come into conflict with school ways of knowing and school kinds of knowledge. And I think that's what an NGO like the WAM, the Canoes of the Marshall Islands, is trying to do, is that they're trying to kind of come to a place where they are kind of educating Marshall Islands children, both in terms of their cultural heritage, but their cultural heritage adapted to a kind of modern skills environment. So they'll teach them how to traditionally build canoes, but they'll also make sure that they can build a table or they can build a house. And you know, they get the bank to come and talk to them. I think I had the citation where Elson said, I give each of them 25 cents and they open a bank account. You know, he gets documents for them. A lot of these kids don't even have birth certificates or anything like that. So he gets them kind of documented. But at the same time, he is ensuring that they learn the ways of their culture. And with the canoe is really interesting because it's not just about building a canoe. It's a whole kind of sense of well-being and a whole sense of life. So people will talk about the bits and pieces of the canoe as bits and pieces of a family. But he only takes 25 kids every year into that program, so that the capacity is so small. You know, and he's dependent on funding and you know, people, I guess, people like me sometimes going there, and you have a little canoe, you have a canoe ride on the lagoon, and you pay for that, or you give donations and things to them. So yeah.
I see you've got Carol's hand up. So, Carol, maybe we can go to you next.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Shari. You partly answered the questions already. The question I had in mind. I find your talk extremely interesting, and it really connects to me with similar situations that I've seen in other parts of the world and remote communities. And I would be interested to hear a little bit more about that issue of the curriculum in schools not being aligned at all with the everyday life of the people and of the children, and all the issues surrounding local knowledge. But I wonder, because you said there's a lot of reliance, of course, on the United States, and you did mention other Pacific islands like Fiji, Tonga, and Solomon. And I wonder if there is any link, because you did point out towards maybe a change towards a better alignment into the curriculum. You said at a point this was changing. But I was wondering if there were more involvements from NGOs or schools or universities, like the South Pacific universities from other Pacific islands. And I'm not talking, of course, about Australia or New Zealand, but the one that have really culturally, very strong cultural link and historical link. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think because the Marshall Islands is sort of part of what is thought of as kind of Micronesia and the US affiliated Pacific, the connections tend to be with, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, like, further, I guess, the Northern Marianas, places like Guam. These are all places that are kind of connected in terms of travel as well. So there's this flight that goes from, Honolulu around all the islands where there are kind of US bases and things. There's an NGO called PREL that we partnered up with, which is called Pacific Resources in Education and Learning. That's a US NGO based in Honolulu, but they work with the US affiliated Pacific, so the places that I just mentioned, and I think they have particular issues, and because they have relationships with the United States, whereas, like you were saying, the other Pacific islands have historically, Fiji historically has had, is connected to Britain, and some of the other places, I guess, have connections with New Zealand, or migration routes and patterns with New Zealand or with Australia. So yeah, I don't see. I mean, when you're in Honolulu, you see all these Pacific Islander kids kind of, mixed up together in the schools. And you see the migrants from the Marshall Islands, from places from FSM like Chuuk and one of Chuukie's kids, mixed up with Samoans and Tongans, all in the same school. But yeah, there isn't. I don't know. I think because the Marshall Islands has had that very specific history. That, I mean, yes, it is comparable, I suppose, to places in the French Pacific that have had nuclear testing as well. Yeah, there isn't. No, I think those are good questions, Carol. I don't think so. I mean, there's this educational connection with Fiji through USP, right. And there is a campus. There's a USP campus in Majuro. But PREL, this NGO, is developing lots of kind of specifically Marshallese resources for the curriculum. So the curriculum has been rewritten by the Marshall Islands government. It's not, but it's a content-driven curriculum. So there's no focus on the pedagogies that are supposed to be used or anything like that. And this is one of the things that Asian Development Bank project is trying to address, is kind of pedagogical training. So when I was writing these schemes of work, it wasn't just like they don't match what these kids are supposed to be able to do, but I couldn't assume any knowledge on the part of the teachers about the pedagogies that I was supposed to be, you know, promoting. So I ended up, like, as soon as I came up with an activity or something for them to do, I just thought, oh, hold on, I don't think the kids will be able to do this. So I made support sheets for the kids. And then I thought, hold on a second, I don't think the teachers know the answers to these questions, or they know what this pedagogy is. So then I had to make, you know, so it actually just became a really, I mean, but I mean, that's all me going on my anecdotal experience of having been in some classrooms and met some teachers is, yeah, I mean, I just, it's really difficult to know where to start addressing the issues.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering, I mean, just very briefly, because in all the Pacific Islands, they go through the same ecological crisis at the moment. So I was just wondering if there were more relations now among them, and that would impact positively on education.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I guess there's the Pacific Islands Forum and things like that, although that seems to be going into meltdown at the moment. Yeah. Because I think they would rotate presidency across the different regions in the Pacific. And I think it was Micronesia's turn, and Cook Islander got the presidency, and now they've all fallen out with each other. So yeah, things like there are organisations, yeah, absolutely, around things like climate change and also around education, like Pacific. I guess they're reviewing education, and there's the Pacific Island literacy numeracy assessment as well. I couldn't get the country report for the Marshall Islands. The regional one's floating around, but the country one isn't for some reason. But again, that's about, I guess, those testing standards, and so I guess there's a way in which that those international comparisons can be helpful, but they can also, I suppose, with, you know, in terms of Will's work, they can also be not helpful. Really. Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty hard place. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Shari, I think you've got a follow up on testing in the chat from Sarah.
What would you replace testing with? I don't know. I mean, I suppose, like, I don't know why you need to test kids so much. You know, in Scotland, we don't test kids at all, really, in primary school. There's no official testing. I mean, there is some kind of surreptitious testing going on, but there are no official national tests. I mean, at the moment, they, you know, we don't do, like in the UK, if you fail a year, you don't repeat the year, you just go on to the next year. So, and that's an American system, as I understand it, is that you repeat a year. If you fail a grade, you repeat a year. So that's what they do in the Marshall Islands. But it does just put, you know, it's hurdles, it's constant kind of hurdles that children have to get over, I guess. And also, when you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the structure in the schools or the staff who are trained and qualified to support students who are not able to meet standards. And then yet those standard tests are there, stopping kids from moving from one grade to another. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so in Canada, we're much lighter on testing than even the UK. Like, at least BC doesn't even have kind of grade 12 tests. But then you have teachers who theoretically have all gone through the same kind of teaching program and hold the same standards. So they're like pushing kids along. We also just push kids up a grade if they fail until they get to high school. And so everything kind of changes. Is that what happens in Scotland? They just get passed up?
Yeah, you just keep going. I mean, you just keep going.
But what if but even in high school?
Yeah. I mean, you can there's even now in England as well, when I was teaching, when I went to school, school was compulsory until you were 16, and now I think they've taken it up to 18. but there are just more channels, more options for you, you know, that you could do vocational courses in school, or you could do, you know, you could take a lower number of exams.
Right.
So that there are different ways. I guess in this country we've had this idea about kind of everyone's in school, and the school includes everybody. But actually your experience of being a teacher in a school is incredibly stressful because actually the school has to do everything for everybody.
Yeah.
So you've got kids that are really struggling and kids that are excelling all in the same classroom. And you know, the classroom teacher has to manage all of that, but that's the job of the education system. Whereas like in the Marshall Islands, they just don't have the means, they don't have the training, they don't have the resources to support students who are struggling, or to help students who are excelling, or just the pastoral, the kind of guidance side of school that we have so much here. I'm not sure that I've not seen evidence of a huge amount of that. And it really is just focusing on, you know, basic things like the kind of language skills and the math skills and that sort of stuff. So I don't know why the science and the social studies, I guess they wanted to introduce, and it's great that those are there, but those are the subjects where they don't have any teachers to teach them. So, and yet they're assessing students.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a kind of weird situation. But I mean, I haven't, like I say, because our research wasn't focused around this at all. It's not something that I've been kind of looking at in a huge amount of depth. And when you know, when I was preparing for this, it was just really interesting to go in, and because I had all this kind of sort of anecdotal evidence about things, and then looking at the statistics does kind of confirm all of that. But yeah, I think they are getting more and more data in, and they're more and more aware of the issues. But you know, I guess that the answers at the moment are just constant projects, ADB, World Bank projects,
right?
And people kind of coming in to try and. So I think the most recent World Bank project is trying to address this issue of secondary access to secondary education and pathways through secondary education. And you know, even things like building boarding schools. No problem, Julia. Thank you so much for coming. Building boarding houses in the schools and things. I think that's like one of the biggest issues with kids going to high school, is the kind of remoteness.
Yeah, and it seems like the technology isn't there to kind of have kids go digitally at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another World Bank project. I think it's called Digital Republic of the Marshall Islands. So it's about kind of getting the internet system up better. It does go up and down. The introduction of kind of 4G Lite is, and the fact that it's really expensive. So now if you go to the Marshall Islands, I mean, I can afford it, but a lot of people can't. And I've also noticed that when I was there in 2017, I was, you know, I became friends on Facebook with loads of kids that we worked with. But now they just don't post anything, and I don't know whether it's just actually their internet access, they can't afford the internet access anymore.
Cool.
Thanks, Courtney. I think we're up anyway. I think it's the end, isn't it? I've been going on and on. Oh, hello.
So we are just about out of time. If you've got any last minute questions, then I'm happy to take those. As you're thinking of last minute questions, just want to thank Shari for her presentation and kind of reflecting back on your work within this project that we're working on collectively on universal secondary education in the Asia Pacific region and barriers. It was also good to see some of our other partners from Bangladesh and the Philippines be able to join us today. I saw you in our little participant list, so I appreciate that. This is a project that's looking at barriers to access in the Asia Pacific region with partners in 5 countries in the region. And so you'll be seeing more of this towards the end of the summer. But our next presentation, and I'll just copy that in here. Our next planned presentation will take place on June 2nd, where Michael Gallagher will be talking about basically what we were just talking about at the end. So can digital help us overcome some of the access barriers globally, but then specifically within the region? So thanks so much, Shari, even for dabbling into the data.
Thanks, Will. Tried my best.
Excellent stuff. So, and thanks everybody for coming today.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks and goodbye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for coming.